Greetings from Cameroon. I'm very happy to be able to tell you about something that we were able to get involved in just last week. But before I do that, let me give you a little bit of history, a little bit of our philosophy here in Cameroon. Our burden here in Cameroon is Cameroon for Christ. It was more than 20 years ago, the first time I came to Cameroon, and the Lord clearly directed and called us to minister and reach Cameroon for Christ. We felt like the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 16 when he received that vision of the Macedonian man telling him to come over into Macedonia and help us. And we followed his pattern. When Paul went into Macedonia to reach this new continent with the gospel and plant churches, the Bible mentions towns and villages that Paul traveled through on his first journey into Macedonia. But he targeted the chief city, that's what Acts chapter 16 calls it, the chief city of that place, which was Philippi. And many were reached, a church was established, and then Paul moved through two other towns or villages that were named in the scriptures. Not that Paul didn't care about those towns and villages, but he had the entire region in mind, and God led him to reach the chief cities so that the entire region from those population centers could be training disciples and sending them out to the rest of the region. Paul went from Philippi to Thessalonica, which was probably the capital of Macedonia in that day. When we came to Cameroon about 14 years ago, we targeted with our prayers and our focus the chief cities of Cameroon. There are 10 regions in Cameroon. The Lord directed us to the capital city of the Northwest region, which is called Bamenda. We've been here the last, as I said, 14 years or so. The Lord's allowed us to see church established in Bamenda and Bambali and Akum, and a little bit farther out in places like Benade and Benakuma, and now reaching out even into Kumbo, but from the chief city, the regional capital. We've also been praying for the other 9 chief cities, the other 9 regions in Cameroon, and the Lord has raised up missionaries and nationals to reach the chief cities of Yaoundé, Douala, Buea, and Bafoussam. We are praying now for those last 5 chief cities. Last week I had the opportunity to visit the regional capital of Adamawa region. It's called Ngaoundéré. We traveled there by plane. Brother Tom Needham and his airplane took me and his son and his daughter-in-law, Daniel and Rachel Needham. We traveled up to Ngaoundéré for about 3 days. As we flew up there, we were able to look down from the airplane and see little compounds and little villages, smaller towns scattered all across the Adamawa region. People, many of whom are illiterate, not been to school, no roads going to their houses, completely cut off, very remote from much of the world. We landed in Ngaoundéré and we were able to begin witnessing, giving out gospel tracts, giving out scripture portions in the Fulfulde language in the market. It was a great, great blessing. We were even able to visit one family. Our taxi driver invited us into his home, and Brother Tom was able to briefly share the gospel with him and his family, and his wife began to immediately dig into that scripture portion of John and Romans in her own language. I'm sure she has never read the Bible in her own language before, and it was clear her desire to know truth. We found that all over in Ngaoundéré. People seeking for peace, people are seeking for truth. They don't know that it can only be found in Jesus Christ. Someone needs to go and preach the gospel in Ngaoundéré. We were burdened. There are maybe as many as 250,000 people living in that city. Most of them are probably Muslim, but maybe almost as much as half are non-Muslim. We saw mosques everywhere we went, and we saw people who need the gospel. Adamawa is a great region. It needs the gospel. It needs a fundamental gospel preaching church that might start a Bible Institute, train nationals, make disciples that will go out to those remote areas, preaching the gospel and taking the gospel to those Fulani, those herdsmen, those nomads, those people living out there on the hills all over Adamawa. Would you please join me in praying that the Lord of the harvest will raise up laborers for the city of Ngaoundéré, that chief city, and that the Lord will use those laborers to make disciples and to scatter disciples all across that region, preaching the gospel until Jesus returns. Join me as well for praying for those other chief cities like Bertoua in the east, Ibolua in the south, Marwa and Garwa in the north and the extreme north of Cameroon. These chief cities still need a fundamental gospel-preaching local church that is spreading the gospel and making disciples. I appreciate you watching this video. I hope you will join me in prayers. Many of you have been praying and concerned about what's going on here in the Northwest region. These other areas I just mentioned, most of them are French-speaking. They're pretty much unaffected by what is going on here in the Northwest and the Southwest regions, but they need the gospel. And I would appreciate if you join us in praying for those areas.